Hello and welcome to History Sleep Stories. Pirates are usually remembered as noise and color, as shouting figures cut loose from society, driven by impulse and violence. Popular stories paint the sea as a stage for chaos, where law dissolves and only bravado survives. Yet this image, repeated so often, smooths over the quieter truth. Most lives at sea were not lived in constant rebellion. They were shaped by hunger, routine, fear, and the slow negotiation between survival and order. If you find comfort in stories like this, consider subscribing for more History Sleep Stories. To understand the Red Flag Fleet, it helps to set those familiar images aside. This was not a floating carnival of lawlessness, nor a myth stitched together by exaggeration. It was a working world, assembled piece by piece from necessity. People did not wake each day seeking adventure. They woke seeking predictability. They sought meals that might arrive, rules that might hold, and a future that felt less fragile than the one they had left behind. The sea itself demanded this shift in thinking. Water does not reward disorder for long. Ships require coordination, timing, and trust. A single mistake can cost more than pride. Over time, those who lived upon the water learned that survival favored structure, not spectacle. The Red Flag Fleet emerged from this understanding, shaped less by ideology than by experience. It grew because it answered needs that land no longer could. This story does not rush toward battle or triumph. It moves at the pace of lived time. It listens for the spaces between events, where most people actually existed. Within those spaces, piracy looks different. It becomes a response to pressure rather than a rejection of society. It becomes a system built to manage risk, distribute resources, and reduce uncertainty in a world that offered few guarantees. Zheng Yi Sao stands at the center of this world, but not as a constant presence. Her influence was felt more than seen, embedded into rules, expectations, and habits. The fleet did not depend on her visibility to function. It depended on the stability her system created. This distinction matters, because it reveals how authority can operate quietly, without spectacle, and still endure. As you enter this history, there is no need to hurry. Let modern assumptions soften. Let the sharp edges of pirate legend blur. What remains is not chaos, but rhythm. Not madness, but negotiation. The Red Flag Fleet becomes less a symbol and more a place, inhabited by ordinary people navigating extraordinary limits. This is an invitation to slow down and listen differently. To notice how order can arise where it is least expected, and how survival often favors the unremarkable over the dramatic. The sea holds many stories, but this one begins not with a shout, but with a steady breath, carried forward on water that remembers far more than myth ever could. In that quiet space, history feels closer, less distant, inviting reflection rather than judgment, and allowing the listener to rest inside a world that once moved slowly, deliberately, and with purpose before fading gently back into silence. Before the Red Flag Fleet could exist as an organized power, the South China Sea already carried a long memory of movement, exchange, and exposure. It was not an empty stage waiting for pirates to arrive, but a living system shaped by centuries of travel and dependence. Coastal communities leaned toward the water not out of romance, but necessity, building their lives around tides that brought both sustenance and uncertainty. The sea fed villages, connected markets, and at the same time left them vulnerable to forces they could rarely control. Trade routes threaded the region like veins, carrying silk, ceramics, tea, salt, and grain between ports large and small. Junks moved steadily along familiar paths, guided by monsoon winds that dictated when ships could sail and when they must wait. These seasonal rhythms were understood intimately by sailors and merchants alike, forming an invisible calendar that governed economic life. When the winds shifted, entire coastlines adjusted, markets swelling or emptying in response to patterns older than any single ruler. Along the shores of Guangdong and Fujian, villages existed in a careful balance between land and sea. Fields alone could not sustain growing populations, and fishing alone could not guarantee survival. Families diversified their labor, sending sons to sea while others tended crops or managed small trade. This constant movement between shore and water created communities skilled in navigation, repair, and adaptation. Boats were not luxuries but extensions of daily life, as familiar as tools or homes. Yet this dependence came with risk. Storms could erase months of work in a single night, and shifting sands could alter harbors without warning. Disease traveled easily along the same routes as goods, and a failed season could ripple outward, leaving hunger in its wake. Political authority along the coast was uneven, strong in name but often distant in practice. Local officials struggled to protect long stretches of shoreline, leaving gaps where law faded into improvisation. In this space, maritime vulnerability became a shared condition. Merchants feared loss, fishermen feared storms, and villagers feared both scarcity and sudden violence. Smuggling flourished where taxes were heavy or enforcement weak, blurring the line between legal trade and illicit exchange. The sea did not distinguish between them. It carried all vessels alike, rewarding those who understood its patterns and punishing those who misjudged them. Piracy, in this context, was less an eruption than an evolution. Long before Zheng Yi Sao's rise, small pirate bands appeared wherever opportunity met neglect. They were often former fishermen or sailors, already skilled and already displaced by economic pressure. Some operated seasonally, turning to raiding when fishing failed, then returning quietly to shore life. Others formed loose alliances, testing the limits of what could be taken and how long they could remain unseen. For coastal populations, these figures were not always strangers. They shared dialects, kinship ties, and memories of the same storms. Fear existed, but so did familiarity. The boundary between protection and predation was not always clear, especially when pirates targeted corrupt officials or rival merchants. Survival, rather than ideology, shaped these interactions, creating a moral landscape as fluid as the water itself. Foreign ships added another layer of complexity. European traders pressed into Asian waters with increasing frequency, backed by distant empires and unfamiliar rules. Their presence disrupted existing balances, introducing new goods, weapons, and pressures. Local traders navigated these changes cautiously, aware that opportunity and danger often arrive together. The South China Sea became a crowded space, not just physically, but politically and economically. Amid this density, information mattered. Knowing when convoys sailed, which ports were weakly defended, and how officials rotated could mean the difference between profit and ruin. Knowledge traveled quickly along the coast, carried by sailors, dockworkers, and traders who watched patterns repeat. This informal intelligence network laid the groundwork for larger organizations to emerge, ones capable of coordinating movement across wide distances. By the time Zheng Yi Sao would later inherit and reshape the Red Flag Fleet, the conditions for such a force were already in place. The sea had trained its people to think collectively, to read systems rather than moments. It had exposed the limits of isolated action and the value of coordination. What seemed chaotic from a distance was, up close, a world governed by cycles, habits, and shared vulnerability. Understanding this earlier landscape matters because it reveals how little of the fleet's later success was accidental. The South China Sea before the fleet was a region accustomed to risk but reliant on cooperation, shaped by trade yet threatened by its own openness. It was a place where power drifted easily and settled only where structure could hold it. In such an environment, the emergence of a disciplined maritime order was not a disruption of normal life, but a continuation of it, refined and intensified. As this world settled into its familiar rhythms, it carried within it the quiet expectation that someone would eventually learn to command those rhythms rather than merely endure them. The sea waited, as it always had, offering the same paths, the same dangers, and the same promise to anyone able to see beyond the horizon and imagine something more enduring than survival alone. That expectation did not announce itself loudly. It lingered in the background of daily labor, in the way sailors spoke about protection and merchants spoke about fairness. People adapted because they had to, not because they dreamed of domination. Still, each adaptation left behind a trace, a lesson about what worked and what failed. Over time, those lessons accumulated, shaping a quiet readiness for change that few could articulate but many could feel. The South China Sea, before it became synonymous with a single fleet, was therefore a teacher. It taught patience through waiting winds, discipline through repetition, and caution through loss. It also taught that survival improved when individuals aligned themselves with something larger than their own vessel. Long before red flags were raised, the idea of collective strength had already been tested and proven in small, fragmented ways. When the conditions finally aligned for a unified maritime power to take shape, it would draw deeply from this inherited knowledge. The sea had already prepared its people to recognize order when it appeared, and to understand its value without needing it explained. In that sense, the rise of the fleet was less a sudden turning point than the natural next chapter in a long, unfinished story. The currents, the coasts, and the communities were already aligned, waiting for leadership capable of binding experience into lasting, shared direction across generations and waters together. The sea that had taught patience and coordination also taught another lesson, quieter and more personal, about the limits of endurance. For many who lived along its edges, survival was never guaranteed, only managed from one season to the next. When the winds failed, when harvests thinned, or when officials demanded more than a village could give, ordinary life narrowed until choices felt less like decisions and more like reactions. It was within this narrowing that piracy began to make sense, not as defiance, but as continuation. Most people who eventually sailed under pirate banners did not begin with violence in mind. They began with debt, with hunger, with obligations that could not be met through honest labor alone. Coastal economies were fragile, dependent on trade cycles and political stability that often shifted without warning. A single disrupted route could collapse local markets, leaving skilled sailors suddenly without work and families without income. When legal trade dried up, the skills remained, unused but still valuable. Government protection along the coast was inconsistent, and its presence was often felt more sharply through taxation than security. Officials rotated frequently, each new arrival seeking to extract value before moving on. This created a climate of short-term authority, where long-term welfare mattered less than immediate gain. For villagers and sailors, this meant paying into systems that rarely paid back. Resentment grew quietly, not toward the idea of law, but toward its absence when needed most. In such conditions, informal solutions flourished. Communities relied on mutual aid, shared labor, and personal networks to survive lean periods. When those networks extended offshore, they sometimes intersected with smuggling or protection arrangements that blurred legality. A sailor might escort a shipment one season, fish the next, and raid a poorly defended vessel after that, each action justified by circumstance rather than ideology. Identity shifted with need, fluid as the water beneath the hull. The sea itself encouraged this fluidity. Unlike land, it offered few fixed boundaries and fewer witnesses. Authority weakened with distance from shore, creating spaces where rules were negotiated rather than enforced. For those already accustomed to risk, stepping beyond legality felt less like crossing a line and more like moving into familiar uncertainty. Piracy, in this sense, was not a break from maritime life but an extension of its most precarious edges. Families were drawn into these choices indirectly. When income vanished, daughters were sold into service, sons were apprenticed early, and older relatives were left to manage shrinking resources. The pressure to contribute became immediate and personal. Joining a pirate crew, even temporarily, could mean sending money home or ensuring protection for one's village. The moral weight of such decisions was heavy, but so was the alternative of inaction. Over time, patterns emerged. Certain harbors became known as places where crews could be found, others as places best avoided. Knowledge circulated quietly, through dockside conversations and shared meals, about which groups honored agreements and which did not. Trust, once earned, became a form of currency. This trust was fragile, but in a world of limited options, it mattered more than official promises that often went unkept. It is important to understand that piracy did not offer freedom so much as structure of a different kind. Crews required coordination, discipline, and shared risk. Loot had to be divided, decisions made, and consequences enforced. For many, this predictability, however harsh, contrasted favorably with the randomness of poverty. At sea, danger was expected, even prepared for. On land, it often arrived without warning. As more people turned toward these maritime alternatives, small groups began to recognize the advantages of cooperation. Independent raiders faced constant threats from rivals and authorities alike. Alliances offered protection, shared intelligence, and the ability to negotiate from strength rather than desperation. These early coalitions were unstable, but they hinted at what could be achieved through unity rather than isolation. None of this required romantic ambition. It grew from repetition, from watching what failed and what endured. Each failed harvest, each seized cargo, reinforced the lesson that survival improved when risk was shared and rules were clear. Piracy became less about rebellion and more about adaptation, a response shaped by environment rather than ideology. This gradual normalization of piracy did not erase fear or doubt. Many who joined crews carried hesitation with them, unsure how long they would stay or what they might become. Yet the longer they remained, the more familiar the rhythms felt. The sea had always demanded resilience. Now it offered, in return, a form of belonging that land-based society increasingly struggled to provide. By the time larger fleets began to form, the idea of piracy as an organized livelihood no longer felt shocking. It felt inevitable, the logical outcome of pressures applied steadily over time. The world that created pirates did so quietly, through scarcity, neglect, and the slow erosion of alternatives. When leadership eventually emerged to harness this scattered energy, it did not invent piracy. It inherited a population already shaped by necessity, ready for structure, and accustomed to finding order wherever it could be made. In this way, the rise of organized fleets was less a turning point than a gathering. Lives that had been drifting separately began to align, not out of shared vision, but shared experience. The sea had taught them what endurance required. The world had taught them what happened without it. By the time the red flag fleet began to take shape, joining it rarely felt like a single, decisive moment. It was more often a gradual crossing, one that began long before a ship was sighted or an offer spoken aloud. You might already have been standing at the edge of your former life, aware that it no longer held you as securely as it once had. When the fleet entered your awareness, it did not always announce itself with force. Sometimes it arrived as a rumor, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as a solution quietly presented when other paths had closed. For some, entry came through capture. A trading vessel slowed by weather or poor timing would be surrounded, boarded, and stripped of its authority with practiced efficiency. Yet even here, the transition was rarely chaotic. Once resistance ended, choices were offered with calm clarity. You could be released with nothing, pressed into service, or absorbed into a system that promised food, protection, and structure. The fear of the moment was real, but it was quickly replaced by the deeper uncertainty of what came next. Others approached the fleet deliberately, guided by word of mouth rather than force. You may have heard that the red flag ships paid reliably, that disputes were settled consistently, that survival was not left to chance. These were not romantic promises, but practical ones. When you stepped forward voluntarily, you did so knowing that return was unlikely, and that acceptance came with obligations you could not yet fully imagine. Still, the certainty of commitment sometimes felt preferable to the slow erosion of life on shore. There were also those for whom desperation narrowed perception until opportunity and coercion became indistinguishable. Debt, hunger, or family pressure pushed decisions into motion before reflection could intervene. In these cases, joining the fleet felt less like choosing and more like being carried. You might remember the moment vaguely, as if it happened to someone else, marked not by drama but by resignation. The sea has a way of absorbing such moments, smoothing their edges as distance grows. Once aboard, the first change was silence. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of explanation. Orders were given without ceremony, routines demonstrated rather than discussed. You were expected to observe, to adapt, to learn by doing. This created a psychological pause, a space where your previous identity was no longer useful, but a new one had not yet formed. In that space, uncertainty lingered, steady and unavoidable. Time behaved differently here. Days were structured, yet your sense of self lagged behind the rhythm. You followed instructions, shared meals, and slept among strangers whose faces became familiar before their stories did. Trust was not demanded, only compliance. Belonging, if it came at all, arrived later, quietly, through repetition rather than affirmation. The fleet did not require you to forget your past, but it offered little room to dwell on it. There was no ceremony of arrival, no declaration of allegiance. Instead, there was work, and through work, a gradual recalibration of expectations. You learned where you stood by how others treated you, by the tasks you were given, by the boundaries that were enforced without anger or explanation. This clarity, though initially unsettling, began to feel stabilizing. Fear did not vanish, but it changed shape. The sharp fear of capture or starvation softened into a more predictable awareness of consequence. You began to understand what was permitted and what was not, what earned respect and what invited correction. This predictability created a strange calm, one rooted not in kindness, but in consistency. You were no longer guessing what might happen next. As days turned into weeks, the fleet's internal logic became more visible. Hierarchies were observed, not questioned. Rewards and punishments followed patterns. You noticed that survival depended less on strength than on attentiveness, less on bravery than on restraint. The sea still demanded respect, but now so did the rules that governed those who moved upon it. At some point, often without noticing, you stopped thinking of yourself as temporary. The idea of leaving faded, replaced by the practical focus of maintaining position. You learned names, habits, unspoken expectations. Shared labor created shared understanding, and familiarity grew from proximity rather than intention. The fleet did not ask for loyalty immediately. It allowed it to emerge, if it would. This transition was not without loss. There were moments, especially in quiet hours, when memories surfaced unexpectedly. Faces from shore, routines once taken for granted, paths not taken. Yet even these reflections were tempered by the awareness that return was uncertain at best. The fleet existed in the present, and it required your attention there. Dwelling too long elsewhere served no one. Gradually, the language you used shifted. You spoke of we instead of they, of shared outcomes instead of individual survival. This was not imposed, it developed as a practical response to shared risk. The sea did not distinguish between old identities. When storms came or conflict arose, outcomes were collective. Your safety was tied to others, whether you wished it or not. In this way, entering the Red Flag Fleet was less about becoming a pirate and more about becoming part of a system. The transition was psychological before it was ideological. You adapted not because you were transformed, but because adaptation was necessary. Over time, necessity shaped behavior, and behavior shaped belonging. By the time you fully understood where you were, the question of how you arrived mattered less. What mattered was that you had crossed into a world with its own rules, rhythms, and expectations. The uncertainty that marked your entry did not disappear, but it settled into the background, replaced by the steady awareness of structure. You were no longer drifting alone. You were moving within something larger, carried forward by forces that now included you. Once you had settled into the rhythm of the fleet, it became clear that what held it together was not fear alone, nor charisma, nor chance. It was order. Not the kind imposed loudly or constantly, but one that existed beneath every action, shaping behavior before conflict could arise. The Red Flag Fleet functioned less like a roaming band and more like a moving settlement, governed by rules that were known, remembered, and rarely tested without consequence. Discipline here did not announce itself through constant punishment. Instead, it revealed itself through predictability. You learned quickly that nothing was arbitrary. Every role had a boundary, every boundary a reason. Authority flowed downward in visible lines, from commanders to officers to crews, each level accountable to the one above it. This structure removed uncertainty, replacing it with a clear understanding of where you stood and what was expected of you. The rules themselves were not hidden. They were spoken, repeated, enforced evenly. Theft within the fleet was forbidden. Violence without sanction was punished. Disobedience carried consequences that were neither exaggerated nor negotiable. What mattered most was not severity, but consistency. You did not wonder whether a rule would be enforced. You knew that it would be, and that knowledge shaped behavior more effectively than threat ever could. This predictability created an unexpected sense of safety. In a world where the sea could change without warning, the internal order of the fleet remained steady. You could anticipate outcomes, plan actions, and trust that agreements would be honored. This stability was not gentle, but it was reliable, and reliability became its own form of protection. Hierarchy was accepted not because it was romantic, but because it worked. Commanders were chosen for competence, not lineage. Positions were maintained through performance rather than favoritism. If authority was abused, it was addressed, not ignored. This reinforced the idea that power within the fleet served function, not ego. Even those at the lowest levels understood that order benefited everyone, including themselves. Punishment, when it came, was deliberate and restrained. It was designed to correct behavior, not to terrorize. Public enough to reinforce rules, but not theatrical. This balance prevented resentment from festering unchecked. You might fear consequence, but you did not fear randomness. That distinction mattered more than you might have expected. Over time, the rules ceased to feel imposed. They became part of the environment, as natural as the creak of the hull or the shift of wind. You adjusted your behavior instinctively, not out of constant awareness, but because the structure supported survival. In this way, discipline became less about control and more about cohesion. What challenged many assumptions was how this order extended beyond daily tasks. Disputes were settled through established processes. Shares of loot were distributed according to agreed formulas. Injuries were compensated. Families of fallen members were supported. These practices transformed the fleet into something resembling a social system rather than a temporary alliance. Commitment was rewarded with continuity. This governance also limited excess. No individual, regardless of rank, operated entirely outside the rules. Authority existed within boundaries, and those boundaries were respected because they were enforced. This prevented chaos from spreading inward, even as the fleet projected power outward. The contrast between external threat and internal order became one of the fleet's defining strengths. Living within this structure reshaped perception. What once might have seemed restrictive began to feel enabling. The rules did not remove freedom entirely, but they channeled it. You were free to act within known limits, free from the constant negotiation of uncertainty. This clarity reduced tension, allowing focus to shift from survival alone to collective function. The absence of impulsiveness was striking. Decisions were rarely rushed. Responses were measured. This patience reflected confidence in the system's durability. The fleet did not rely on constant displays of force to maintain control. It relied on the shared understanding that order served everyone's interest. As you absorbed this, your expectations changed. You stopped bracing for sudden shifts in treatment. You learned to trust patterns. This trust did not make you complacent, but it did allow a different kind of attention to emerge, one oriented toward maintaining balance rather than anticipating disaster. The Red Flag Fleet's discipline was not accidental. It was cultivated, maintained, and defended because it was essential. Without it, the fleet could not have sustained itself at scale. Order transformed the collection of ships into a unified force, capable of endurance rather than brief disruption. By living under these rules, you became part of something that valued stability over spectacle. The myths of lawlessness faded, replaced by the reality of governance at sea. What seemed contradictory at first, pirates bound by strict codes, revealed itself as necessary. In a volatile world, order was not a luxury. It was survival. The stability created by rules made the days themselves feel different. Once order was established, time aboard a red flag ship no longer arrived in sharp fragments of danger and reaction. It unfolded slowly, predictably, shaped by routine rather than surprise. A day at sea was not marked by drama, but by repetition, and it was this repetition that allowed the mind to settle into a quieter rhythm. You wake before sunrise, not to alarm or command, but to movement. The ship is already awake. Wood shifts, ropes tighten, water slides along the hull. There is no urgency in the air, only continuation. The same tasks return each morning, and because they return, they require less thought. Bodies move before minds fully engage, guided by habit rather than instruction. Morning begins with preparation. Sails are checked, lines adjusted, decks cleared. Each action has its place, and each person knows where to stand. The sea at this hour is often calm, its surface reflecting pale light as if holding its breath. Work proceeds without conversation, not because silence is enforced, but because it is unnecessary. Everyone understands what must be done. As the sun rises, the ship settles into motion. Meals are simple and taken without ceremony. Eating is not an event but a function, folded naturally into the flow of work. There is comfort in this lack of emphasis. Nothing is rushed, nothing delayed. Hunger is met, then attention returns to the tasks that fill the hours. Mid-morning brings maintenance. Wood is inspected, tools are cleaned, small repairs addressed before they become larger ones. This is where the fleet's preference for prevention becomes visible. Problems are not ignored until they demand crisis. They are handled quietly, early, without acknowledgement beyond completion. Time stretches in the late morning. The sea passes in steady patterns, waves repeating themselves with slight variation. This sameness is not dull. It is reassuring. Each repetition confirms that the system holds. The mind adjusts, releasing tension it no longer needs to carry. At midday, activity slows. Not because work stops, but because it changes. Tasks become lighter, movement less constant. Some sit, some stand watch, others simply observe the horizon. Conversation may surface here, brief and unremarkable. Stories are exchanged without embellishment. Laughter, when it appears, is short and contained, then fades back into the larger rhythm. The afternoon resembles the morning, but softer. Sunlight warms the deck. Shadows lengthen. The ship continues forward, unchanged in purpose. There is no sense of waiting for something to happen. What matters is that nothing needs to. As evening approaches, preparations begin again. Sails are adjusted for night conditions. Supplies are checked. The order that structured the morning returns, reinforcing continuity. There is satisfaction in this return, a quiet recognition that the day has moved as expected. Dinner mirrors breakfast in its simplicity. Food is shared, not discussed. The body recognizes routine nourishment as assurance. Hunger is answered, and with it, rest draws nearer. Night watch is assigned without ceremony. Those who sleep do so deeply, accustomed to the motion beneath them. The ship rocks gently, a constant presence that replaces stillness. Dreams, if they come, are shaped by repetition rather than fear. Those awake at night experience the fleet differently. The sea is darker, quieter. Stars replace landmarks. Yet even here, there is structure. Watches change on time. Duties are clear. The darkness does not feel empty because it is filled with known patterns. In these hours, the absence of chaos becomes most apparent. Nothing demands immediate reaction. The ship moves, the sea responds, and life continues within the boundaries already established. Eventually, night gives way to morning again. The cycle resets, unchanged. There is comfort in knowing what comes next. The day has no climax, no resolution. It simply completes itself and begins again, steady and unremarkable. This is how normalcy takes hold. Not through excitement, but through reliability. Over time, the extraordinary fades. The fleet becomes less an adventure and more a place. And within that place, routine replaces uncertainty, allowing those aboard to exist without constant vigilance, carried forward by the quiet assurance of another ordinary day. There are days when weather shifts, but even then the rhythm bends rather than breaks. Clouds gather, wind rises, and the ship responds as it always has. Commands are brief, movements practiced. No one panics because nothing is new. The sea may demand attention, but it does not steal control. When rain comes, it is absorbed into the routine, coats pulled closer, tasks adjusted, pace maintained. The storm passes, leaving the day intact. Between duties, moments of stillness appear. Leaning against the rail, watching water divide and reform, you feel time differently. Hours are not measured by clocks but by light and labor. This way of living does not shrink the world. It simplifies it. Decisions narrow. Concerns soften. The mind learns to rest inside the predictable. As days repeat, memory changes. Individual moments blur, but the sense of continuity strengthens. You stop recalling specific mornings and begin to remember the feeling of mornings. The smell of salt, the weight of rope, the sound of wood settling become anchors, grounding thought without demanding attention. Rest is not luxurious, but it is sufficient. Sleep comes when assigned, not stolen. The body adapts to movement, finding stillness within motion. Dreams align with rhythm, untroubled by sharp interruption. Waking feels less like an intrusion and more like a continuation. Over weeks, the ship itself becomes familiar in intimate ways. You recognize its sounds, its responses, its moods. A certain creak signals wind change. A vibration suggests adjustment. This familiarity reduces effort. Awareness becomes intuitive rather than alert. Even conflict, when it arises, follows pattern. Disagreements are addressed, resolved, absorbed back into routine. Nothing lingers long enough to disrupt the larger flow. The day continues, indifferent to individual tension, offering structure that outlasts emotion. By the time another sunrise arrives, you realize that what once seemed monotonous has become stabilizing. The absence of constant novelty allows attention to settle inward. Thoughts slow. Anxiety finds fewer places to cling. The day ends as it began, without announcement. Light fades, tasks conclude, watches rotate. There is no signal that marks completion. Completion is implied by continuity. Tomorrow will resemble today, and that resemblance carries its own quiet promise. In this way, chaos is replaced not by excitement, but by endurance. Life aboard the Red Flag fleet does not rush toward meaning. It accumulates it slowly, through days that ask little more than presence. And within that presence, time becomes less an adversary and more a companion, moving alongside you, steady and unremarkable, yet deeply reassuring. This steady cycle reshapes expectation itself. You no longer wait for change to justify the hours. The hours justify themselves through repetition. Each completed task affirms the system's reliability, each quiet interval reinforces belonging. What once felt like confinement begins to feel like enclosure, a defined space where uncertainty is held at bay. The day passes, whole and intact, and you pass with it, unhurried, supported by routine that asks nothing extraordinary, only that you remain. Tomorrow will arrive the same way, and that sameness offers rest without demand. Gently. As the days repeated and the rhythm of work settled into something familiar, attention naturally turned inward, toward the spaces between tasks and the ways life was shared within the ship itself. Routine did not end when work paused. It simply shifted form, expressing itself through eating, resting, and existing together in close quarters. These quieter aspects of life shaped identity just as deeply as discipline or labor. Food aboard a red flag ship was never abundant, but it was reliable. Meals followed the same unspoken schedule, appearing at expected times without ceremony. Bowls were passed, portions divided, and eating became a communal act rather than an individual indulgence. No one lingered over flavors. Taste mattered less than sufficiency. What gave the food meaning was not what it was, but that it arrived consistently, reinforcing the sense that the system would provide what was necessary, if not more. Eating together erased certain distinctions. Rank softened at these moments, not disappearing, but relaxing. Conversation, when it happened, stayed practical or observational. There was little appetite for complaint. Scarcity was understood as a shared condition, not a personal misfortune. Over time, expectations adjusted. Hunger learned patience, and satisfaction came not from fullness, but from regularity. Sleep followed similar patterns. Space was limited, privacy nearly non-existent, yet rest still found its place. Hammocks were strung close together, bodies swaying gently with the movement of the ship. The closeness, which might have felt oppressive at first, gradually became familiar. The presence of others created a sense of enclosure, a boundary against the vastness outside the hull. Breathing, shifting, murmured dreams blended into a shared background, reassuring rather than intrusive. There was little silence, but there was quiet. Sound softened through repetition. The creak of wood, the wash of water, the occasional call from watch became part of the sleep itself. You did not wait for stillness to rest. You rested within motion, trusting it to continue without disturbance. Living space extended beyond where one slept. The deck, the narrow walkways, the sheltered corners all carried meaning depending on time of day. Certain spots became associated with rest, others with conversation, others with solitude despite proximity. You learned where to stand without being in the way, where to sit without inviting interruption. These unspoken understandings reduced friction, allowing many lives to overlap without constant negotiation. Personal belongings were few, but they mattered. Small objects carried memory and continuity, reminders of lives before the fleet. These items were respected, rarely touched without permission. In an environment defined by sharing, boundaries still existed, subtle but honored. This balance prevented resentment, reinforcing trust through restraint rather than enforcement. Communal living encouraged observation. You learned the habits of those around you without trying. Who woke early, who slept deeply, who preferred silence, who sought brief conversation. These patterns informed interaction, shaping a social rhythm that mirrored the physical one. Over time, identity became relational. You understood yourself partly through how you fit among others. Discomfort existed, but it was normalized. Tight space, limited air, constant motion were not framed as suffering, but as conditions. Complaining did not remove them, so adaptation took precedence. Bodies adjusted posture. Minds adjusted expectation. What once felt restrictive became simply the way things were. This acceptance did not erase individuality. Instead, it softened its edges. Personal preferences yielded where necessary, but did not vanish. Small choices, how to arrange a hammock, when to eat quickly or slowly, how to occupy a quiet moment, preserved a sense of self within the collective. Shared living also created accountability. Actions affected others immediately. Noise traveled. Movement rippled. This awareness encouraged consideration without formal rule. Courtesy became practical rather than moral. Respect emerged not from instruction, but from proximity. Violence, when it occurred, was restrained. It was not random, nor personal. It was procedural. This distinction mattered. Random violence breeds anxiety because it cannot be anticipated. Procedural punishment, however severe, stabilizes behavior by defining limits clearly. You might dislike the rule, but you understood it. That understanding reduced mental strain. Silence played a role in this system. Consequences were not debated publicly. Explanations were minimal. There was no need to justify what everyone already knew. This silence prevented escalation. It kept fear from spreading unnecessarily. You learned through observation rather than constant reminder. The knowledge of discipline influenced interactions subtly. Disputes were resolved quickly or avoided altogether. Tempers cooled faster because outcomes were known. Pride yielded to practicality. Fear did not inflame emotion. It contained it. Living within such a system required emotional adjustment. At first, the certainty of consequence felt heavy. Over time, it became reassuring. You stopped scanning for unpredictable threat. Attention shifted from vigilance to participation. This psychological shift reduced exhaustion more effectively than comfort ever could. Authority was reinforced through consistency rather than presence. Leaders did not need to assert themselves constantly. Their power was embedded in the system they maintained. This distance prevented resentment from attaching to individuals. Discipline was not personal. It belonged to the fleet itself. Even darker themes were absorbed into routine. Punishment, when remembered, did not linger as trauma so much as instruction. Memory served as boundary marker rather than wound. The fleet did not deny fear. It integrated it, preventing it from dominating thought. Fear also protected cohesion. Knowing that consequences applied equally discouraged favoritism and rebellion. This fairness, however strict, fostered trust. You might fear the rules, but you trusted their application. That trust mattered more than comfort. There were moments when silence deepened, when an absence of sound marked enforcement. These moments passed quickly, folded back into daily rhythm. The fleet did not dwell on them. Dwelling would have amplified fear beyond usefulness. Instead, life continued, steady and unchanged. This approach prevented fear from becoming corrosive. It did not erode morale slowly. It maintained boundaries efficiently. By avoiding spectacle, the fleet avoided obsession. Fear remained a tool, not a condition. Over time, the presence of discipline faded into background awareness. You no longer thought about it actively. You simply acted within it. This internalization freed mental space. Anxiety decreased because choices were clear. Consequence did not lurk unpredictably. It waited patiently at known edges. The restraint shown by leadership reinforced legitimacy. Power that does not need to display itself constantly feels more secure. This security filtered downward. The fleet felt controlled without feeling volatile. Even in moments of tension, escalation was limited by structure. Fear, in this environment, was not the opposite of safety. It was one component of it. Boundaries created safety by preventing chaos. You rested more easily knowing that others were governed by the same limits. At night, when the ship quieted, fear did not surface uninvited. The absence of sudden threat allowed sleep to come naturally. Dreams were not haunted by unpredictability. The system held, even in darkness. This silent discipline shaped behavior more effectively than constant force ever could. It taught without shouting. It corrected without chaos. It maintained order without exhausting those within it. By normalizing consequence, the fleet normalized calm. Fear existed, but it was contained, understood, and purposeful. It did not demand attention. It simply stood in place, marking boundaries that allowed everything else to function. In this way, discipline became part of the environment, as stable as the deck beneath your feet. You did not question its presence daily. You relied on it, often without noticing. And in that reliance, fear lost its sharpness, becoming instead a quiet reminder of structure, reinforcing a world where uncertainty had already been reduced as much as the sea would allow. The quiet certainty that governed discipline did not emerge on its own. It carried the imprint of a single guiding presence, one that rarely needed to appear to be felt. Zheng Yi Sao's power aboard the fleet was not defined by visibility. It was defined by absence. You did not see her often, and yet her influence shaped nearly every decision, every rule, every expectation that structured life beneath the red flags. Her authority was not reinforced through constant command. It was embedded into the system itself. Rules did not feel temporary or negotiable because they were understood to originate from a source beyond any individual officer. This distance elevated them. Orders felt less like personal demands and more like fixed realities, as immovable as tide or wind. You learned about her not through speeches, but through repetition. Through the consistency of enforcement. Through the knowledge that nothing within the fleet existed outside her awareness, even if she was not physically present. This understanding created a form of power that did not need to announce itself. It simply existed, shaping behavior quietly and continuously. Stories circulated, but they were restrained. Not exaggerated tales of cruelty or heroism, but practical reminders of decisions made long ago that still governed the present. These accounts were rarely detailed. They did not need to be. Their purpose was not entertainment, but orientation. They reminded you that the system had an origin, and that origin still mattered. Distance played a critical role. By remaining removed from daily operations, Zheng Yi Sao prevented familiarity from dulling authority. Officers carried out orders, but responsibility traced upward. This separation preserved clarity. If discipline was firm, it was not because an officer chose severity, but because the structure demanded it. This protected cohesion by removing personal blame. Her power was reinforced through design rather than display. The fleet's hierarchy, its codes, its balance between reward and consequence all reflected deliberate construction. Nothing felt accidental. This intentionality signaled competence, and competence inspired trust more effectively than fear ever could. Even those who never saw her felt guided by her decisions. Shares were distributed fairly. Protection extended beyond individuals to families. Loyalty was rewarded with stability. These outcomes carried her signature without requiring her presence. Authority flowed outward through results. This indirect power sustained curiosity without feeding anxiety. You did not wait for her arrival. You adjusted your behavior knowing that arrival was unnecessary. The system functioned whether she watched or not, and that reliability made her influence feel constant rather than conditional. Silence amplified mystique. The absence of frequent reference prevented her image from becoming mundane. When her name surfaced, it carried weight precisely because it was not used casually. This economy of mention preserved significance. Her leadership style avoided spectacle. There were no dramatic interventions to disrupt routine. This restraint reinforced the idea that the fleet did not depend on moments of charisma to survive. It depended on systems that endured beyond moments. You sensed her authority most clearly when nothing went wrong. When disputes resolved predictably. When supplies arrived as expected. When discipline held without escalation. These quiet successes testified to governance more convincingly than any display of force. By remaining largely unseen, she avoided becoming a focal point for resentment or idealization. Loyalty attached to the fleet itself, not to personality alone. This distributed allegiance strengthened durability. The system mattered more than the figure, even as the figure shaped the system. At night, when the ship settled and routine softened, her presence felt distant but intact. There was no need to imagine her watching. It was enough to know that the structure she created continued to function. That knowledge allowed rest. Power expressed this way did not intrude on daily life. It supported it. By staying just beyond reach, Zheng Yi Sao preserved authority without exhausting it. Her influence moved through the fleet like a current, unseen but undeniable, guiding direction without disturbing the surface, allowing life aboard to continue steady, ordered, and remarkably calm under a leadership felt more than it was ever seen. The influence that shaped daily life aboard the Red Flag fleet also shaped a deeper question, one that lingered quietly beneath routine and obedience. With danger ever present and authority absolute, why did so many remain? Why did thousands choose not only to join, but to stay, even when departure was possible? The answer did not lie in loyalty to a symbol or fear of reprisal alone. It lay in comparison. Life beyond the fleet offered few gentle alternatives. Coastal villages lived at the mercy of trade cycles and weather, prosperity rising and collapsing with little warning. Fishermen faced uncertain harvests, taxes they could not predict, and officials they could not appeal to. Merchant sailors endured brutal hierarchies, withheld wages, and constant threat of abandonment. Soldiers served distant powers for promises that often dissolved before returning home. Stability, in most forms, was fragile. Against this landscape, the Red Flag fleet presented something rare. It offered continuity. Not comfort, not safety in the modern sense, but reliability. Food arrived when expected. Rules were enforced evenly. Rewards followed contribution. Punishment followed transgression. The predictability of this exchange reduced mental strain. You did not wonder endlessly about tomorrow. You understood it well enough to rest inside today. Shared survival also mattered. Within the fleet, survival was collective rather than individual. No one faced the sea alone. Injury, loss, and risk were distributed across the group. This reduced isolation, one of the quietest but most damaging burdens of uncertain lives. Even hardship felt lighter when carried together. Mental relief followed structure. Decisions narrowed. Choices simplified. Instead of navigating endless possibilities with unpredictable consequences, life aboard the fleet offered defined paths. This clarity freed attention. Anxiety receded not because danger vanished, but because it became manageable, contained within known boundaries. Belonging reinforced endurance. Identity shifted from individual struggle to collective function. You mattered because your role mattered. This sense of usefulness, often absent elsewhere, provided grounding. Life gained shape through participation rather than ambition. There was also inevitability in staying. Leaving did not guarantee improvement. The world beyond the fleet had not changed simply because you had. Returning meant re-entering instability without the protection of structure. Many recognized this quietly, without despair. Staying was not surrender. It was selection. Over time, the fleet became home not through affection, but through familiarity. Its rhythms replaced uncertainty. Its rules replaced negotiation. Its dangers replaced countless smaller anxieties. This trade, harsh as it was, felt honest. The sea outside remained vast and indifferent. The world beyond remained unstable. Within the Red Flag Fleet, life continued with a steadiness that few other paths offered. For many, that steadiness was enough. It allowed sleep. It allowed routine. It allowed survival without constant fear of sudden collapse. This is why thousands stayed. Not because the fleet promised greatness, but because it delivered consistency. In an era defined by unpredictability, that promise carried weight. History often remembers spectacle, but endurance tells a quieter truth. People remain where life, however constrained, makes sense. And under the red flags, life did. When people eventually left the Red Flag Fleet, or when the fleet itself began to dissolve under pressure from changing political forces, what remained was not a single dramatic ending, but a quiet dispersal. Ships were surrendered, agreements signed, lives redirected back toward land and anonymity. History often searches for climactic collapse, yet the true legacy of the fleet did not announce itself that way. It lingered instead, subtle and unresolved, carried forward in assumptions that would be challenged long after the sails were lowered. The Red Flag Fleet unsettles modern ideas about power because it does not fit neatly into familiar categories. It was neither a chaotic rebellion nor a rigid state. It functioned without the symbols that usually define authority, yet maintained control over vast numbers of people for years. Its strength came not from spectacle, but from structure. Leadership was not loud, but it was precise. Order was not imposed for display, but for endurance. Zheng Yi Sao's legacy rests less in individual acts than in the system she shaped. She demonstrated that authority does not require constant presence, and that fear does not need to be violent to be effective. Her governance relied on predictability, fairness, and distance. These qualities are rarely celebrated in stories of piracy, yet they explain far more about why the fleet endured than any battle or negotiation ever could. The fleet also complicates ideas about freedom. From the outside, life under strict rules appears restrictive. From within, those same rules reduced uncertainty. Freedom was not defined by the absence of constraint, but by relief from chaos. This inversion challenges modern instincts, inviting reflection rather than judgment. History tends to remember extremes. It records violence, triumph, collapse. It struggles with systems that worked quietly, without demanding attention. The red flag fleet belongs to this quieter category. Its daily life, its routines, its internal logic resist simplification. They require patience to understand, and perhaps that is why they are so often overlooked. For those who lived within it, the fleet was not a legend. It was a place. A moving world defined by repetition, structure, and shared survival. Its influence did not end when its ships vanished from the sea. It echoed in the lives of those who passed through it, shaping expectations of order, fairness, and belonging long after they returned to quieter shores. Even now, its story invites a gentler kind of listening. It asks not for excitement, but for consideration. It reminds us that human systems are often built not from ambition, but from necessity. That people will accept limits willingly when those limits provide stability. That leadership can be strongest when it is least visible. As the fleet receded into history, it left behind questions rather than answers. About how power functions when it is restrained. About how communities form under pressure. About how order can emerge in places assumed to be lawless. These questions do not demand immediate resolution. They are meant to be held, contemplated, allowed to settle. In telling this story, there is no need for a sharp ending. The red flag fleet does not conclude so much as it fades, its outlines softening as distance grows. The sea that once carried its ships continues its own rhythm, indifferent to the names once spoken upon it. Trade routes shift. Empires rise and fall. Memory quiets. What remains is a sense of continuity. Of lives lived within a system that made sense in its time. Of structure providing calm where chaos was expected. Of leadership exercised through design rather than display. As this story comes to rest, it does not ask to be remembered loudly. It simply invites reflection. The red flag fleet existed, endured, and dissolved, leaving behind an example that resists easy interpretation. Its legacy is not a warning or a celebration. It is a reminder that history is often quieter than myth suggests. And in that quiet, there is room to let the mind slow, to release the need for conclusion, and to allow the past to remain where it belongs, not demanding attention, but offering it gently, before receding once more into the steady, unremarkable flow of time. Thank you for listening. Rest well, and join us again for History Sleep Stories.